But we have a really good speaker here today. But before we get started, we want to do our land acknowledgement. But before we do that, I want to share again, and I've done this periodically. It was one of our Native American brothers who wrote these words, and I hold them dear, and that is why I repeat them before each Learning Café. And that is, we honor the land as the Creator intended, in that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it shaped this great country. You all signed up today or registered because of our amazing speaker. We've had her before, and we are honored to have her again. And that is, she's going to be speaking again about Gentelligence, how to have smarter intergenerational conversations. This strategy, the Gentelligence strategy, was featured as a Harvard Business Review Big Idea in March of 2022, and was selected as one of the 10 must-read articles for 2024. So what our speaker will do today, she will tell us why it was selected. She will move us past generational stereotypes and learn how to have deeper conversations on how to understand and navigate generational norms in the workplace. She will explore using the 4 Gentelligence practices to have more effective intergenerational conversations, focusing on current challenges such as giving feedback, flexible workplaces, career development, and more. So a little bit about our speaker, Dr. Megan Gerhardt is a professor of management and leadership. She has published widely on generational differences in the workplace and is the author of the book, Gentelligence, A Revolutionary Approach to Leading an Intergenerational Workforce. Her work has been featured, as I said earlier, in the Harvard Business, but also with NBCnews.com, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and many other well-known media outlets. In 2017, her TED Talk, Why I Love Millennials, and You Should Too, was released, and her work continues to focus on leveraging differences to achieve impact and extraordinary levels of performances. So let's settle in, stay engaged, and let's listen. And as I yield this floor to Dr. Megan Gerhardt.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you, Fanny. I need you to come with me on the road and do my intro everywhere I go. I never get a better one than I do here. So thanks again for having me back. I'm excited to go deeper on this conversation with everyone. I think many of you were here with us. I think it was a year ago that we all got together for this first conversation. So thrilled to be back, and I am going to go to the next level of discussions around how do we change our lens on working with, learning from, collaborating with people across generations in our organization. So I'm going to start with just a quick overview of the people maybe that either weren't with us last December, or maybe have had quite a bit of things happening between now and last year, and could do with a short review. But then we're going to jump into what's really going on now and what has even shifted since the last time that we all spoke. So I want to start with really the idea that we are going to enter into this conversation in a very different way than we tend to see in the media or in a lot of generational training. So hopefully you remember that from last time, that we are going to take what I like to call the Gentelligence approach, which is how do we view the fact that we have a multi-generational workplace? We will continue to have a very dynamic multi-generational workplace forever. How do we view that as an opportunity instead of a threat? How do we step away from these really lazy, tired cliches and stereotypes about people in different generations and see those differences that come up when we think about growing up in different periods of time. I love the intro around the collective memories we have of the things that mattered, the things that brought us joy, the way that we thought about the world and success and our place in it. All of those things are very relevant and important, but they're complex. And we often sit on the surface of those discussions so that we can paint with broad brushes people in different generations because it's easier, but that doesn't mean it's helpful. And so we want to go with the Gentelligence approach, means let's get smarter about it. Let's find those opportunities for learning. And maybe at the crux of it, how do we see those differences as fascinating rather than frustrating? So that's the mindset I want us to be in during our time together. I've left time for questions. I would love it if you would use the chat as much as you want as I speak. If something is sparked for you or you have comment or question, please go ahead and use that chat to talk to your colleagues. So as a quick review, I always like to say, why do we end up with all those tired generational stereotypes? Where does that come from? And it does actually root in something relevant and valid, which is the impact of shared experiences. The fact that I'm thinking about the holidays, I'm thinking about, what was the thing that everybody was caring about, when I was turning 9 or 10 years old is certainly very different than what it is now. But these larger formative experiences we have during our most developmental years. So those of you, since you're in education, this is top of mind for all of you. But those years when our brains are forming, when we're deciding what we think about the world and we're deciding what matters and what's important, that 5 to 20 years old, that sort of time span when our brain is open, we have that neuroplasticity where, as you all know, as educators, we can make a real difference in how people think. So when we have these shared experiences, things going on globally, socially, culturally, politically, during those formative years, they have a stronger impact on us than if we had them later in life. So before we joined you, Fanny was asking me some questions about, the pandemic, global conflict. How is that affecting different generations? We're all affected by it, absolutely. But growing up and having your formative childhood years in the midst of a lockdown and a pandemic is going to have a longer, more residual effect on you in the way you see the world than going through a pandemic when you're 45. So that is where these generational norms come from. And I love talking about generational norms because they're not claiming we all have that same viewpoint or that same attitude or the same, belief set because we were born in a particular year. It's just saying the frequency of norms and the ways we believe the world was or should be, they differ over time. So a generational norm is something where you could say, well, many more people in my generation had that experience or thought that way than the people in my parents' generation or my kids' generation. That's all we're talking about. So it doesn't have to be true to the person, but you can look at the norm frequency over time and say, yes, we are going through a different cycle of generational norms now, and that's creating some of these conflicts or conversations we're having in the workplace. And those behaviors and attitudes that surface from that are the things we often get very caught up on in a way that's not productive. So that's just a quick review for those of you who either weren't with us or needed a refresher on this. And then the other thing that I really find important, and I think we had some great conversations about this last year, is generational identity matters in lots of really interesting ways. It also combines with other parts of who you are to create even more depth and complexity to this conversation. So age and generation, being an older Gen Z or a younger baby boomer, et cetera, those things matter. Your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your religion, your socioeconomic status, where you're sitting in the world, those things all matter to this conversation. So we don't want to ignore them. We want to embrace them and say, yes, and. Yes, I'm a Gen Xer and that is where we start getting into these wonderful kind of layers and nuances that are so interesting to talk about. All right, so I'm going to jump to some things that I didn't have to share with you last year that I have really dug into over the last probably 6 to 9 months. which is I want to talk about how we have those amazing generational differences. We also have some really important shared generational needs. So we are different in fascinating ways, but we also have common ground across generations that we sometimes miss. And so I love talking about this too. So if you look at the research, the academic research on generational differences, a lot of it will conclude by saying generational differences really aren't that big, that we're making much ado out of nothing. And that's always been so puzzling to me and to many people, because if you're out there working with people a lot older or younger, you would shake your head and say there's no way that that can be true. So I was really interested in how academics were so sure that generational differences were minimal, but out in the workplace, we are so positive that they're wrong. And this is what I've discovered, and I wanted to share with you sort of the way I like to think about this that makes both of those things possible and true. And that is that we all as humans have shared needs, whether you're 4 or 14 or 40 or 74. Research consistently shows that we have intrinsic, so internal needs that matter your whole entire life, regardless of generation. And they go by slightly different names depending on the study or the line of research we look at. But I've listed a summary of them for you. We all have a need to feel respected, particularly at work, to feel connected to others, to be seen as competent, and have some degree of autonomy and agency over our lives and our work. So if you look at studies that look at things like motivations or needs or values of different generations, they will say, look, these are very, very similar. There really aren't that substantial differences. Generational differences aren't a big deal. And they stop there. So when that happens, we're missing something really, really important. And that's that respect, connection, competence, and autonomy are very important to all of us. And we've likely learned very different norms to fulfill those needs. So let me flip back to give you an example. So let's take a baby boomer who, when they entered the workplace, to earn respect, the norm was you put your head down, you close your mouth, you work hard, you do your job, you wait for someone to come tell you, tap you on the shoulder and say, it's time for your promotion. You've earned it. It's your turn. That's how you earned respect as a norm at that time in the workplace. Fast forward to a millennial who also needs and wants respect in the workplace. But the norm they learned growing up was if you want it, you get yourself to the front of the line and raise your hand and let people know you're ready. You jump in and raise your hand because otherwise someone else is going to, and you're not going to get your chance. Everybody's ready. You got to let them know it's your turn. So the need is the same. The norm to fulfill that need is different because of the generational context. We raised millennials to go get what they were owed or go get what they deserved and to show people they were ready. And what happens then is when a millennial, for example, goes after that respect with that go-getter, elbow your way to the front attitude, it's perceived by a baby boomer, for example, often as entitled because that norm doesn't align with their norm and it doesn't make sense. So we judge the norm instead of seeing the common need and where it's stemming from. And we can do this with all of these different needs. So for example, connection. If you think about everyone needs connection, and time again, I have participants in my keynotes and in workshops who say, these kids today have lost connection. They're disconnected to the world. They're not connecting to the world the way we did when we were their age, but they're connecting to the world in a way that's different and meaningful for them. So they have found new ways to make connection because of the advancements of technology, because of new norms. And when we say they've lost this, or they don't know how to do this, or they lack that, that's a judgment of a norm instead of an acknowledgement of a shared underlying need. So this is so important, and this is an example of how to be more gentelligent. It doesn't mean we have to substitute someone else's norms for our own, but it's a basis for a better, smarter conversation. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this today because we did a deep dive on this last year, but just as a refresher, we right now have 5 generations in our workplace. That's still true. Starting from the silent generation, which makes up about 3% of the US workforce right now, all the way through Gen Z. Our oldest Gen Zs are 26 this year, and our youngest are 11. So we will have Gen Z entering the workplace for another 7 to 10 years as the newest employees. So we are going to have that 5-generation workplace for a few years longer. It's the first time in history we've had 5 generations because we have people living and working longer. And that will be a limited time only. Soon our silent generation will no longer be working, and we will be back to a 4-generation workplace. But right now we're at 5. So I'm just going to remind you here that one of the conversations that I do talk about, I don't want people to get too hung up on certain generations, because I think we then are very quick to put people in these boxes. And that's literally why I put the boxes in here as a reminder. There's fascinating narratives around the way generations develop norms for things like success. We've talked about that last year. And I want you to just think, identify the generation that you're part of. And in addition to Elijah's great intro question for us, also thinking about, what did success mean for me and my friends when we were leaving school? How is that different than maybe it was for my parents, my kids, my nieces, my nephews, my grandkids, whatever it is for you? And then not just success, but some other things we're going to talk about in a minute that represent some really interesting current conversations going on in the workplace. So just a quick reminder that we have many, and that these all come with their own set of generational norms. So to get into these deeper topics, I've really been trying to push the people that I've been speaking with this year to think about, across the globe, we're going to name generations differently depending on the different cultural forces. Across time, in another 20 years, the set of generations working together are going to have different names. But the challenge isn't going to change unless we do the work to reframe the challenge as an opportunity. Because historically, we have always had this sort of tug of war between generations. In our book, we found quotes going all the way back to BC talking about, what the heck is wrong with kids these days. A couple months ago, I posted on LinkedIn a snippet from Life magazine talking about how young people are self-centered and they're never going to survive in the world today, and we're really worried about them. And I got all these positive, that's right, that's so true reactions. And I jumped back in and said that was actually a paragraph written about the baby boomers in the 1950s. So these are not new phenomenon, and it's time to really change the dynamic of this conversation. So as Fanny said, I really want to focus today on, how do we do that? How do we have smarter intergenerational conversations? That's really what Gentelligence is about. Because I don't respond in any kind of way that's helpful when people ask me, well, what do I say when, do all Gen Zs want to go back to remote work fully? Do all baby boomers want this? The answer is no. All of any generation don't want the same thing. I can't tell you who you are if you tell me the year you're born, because that's what horoscopes are for. That's not what this is for. But I can help us have better conversations that are more constructive, where we can start learning and understanding those differences in a way that's more constructive. So this isn't about scripts. It's not about stereotypes. It's about smarter conversations. All right, so let's talk about that strategy that we're going to use. So what I want to do is introduce to you some of the most relevant and interesting ways that generational differences are causing waves in our workplaces, and then talk about how we can have some smarter conversations. So I hope some of these will be relevant to you. I don't know if you guys remember from last year, but I am a generational headline person. So I brought you all kinds of generational headlines last year. These are new ones. So I have swapped them out for you with ones that have shown up just in the last year, in case you thought we were making some progress, not as much as I would like to see. So we're seeing, we saw last year the millennials getting a rough time on this, and now we're seeing similar concerns about Gen Z. So lots of things about Gen Z: challenging managers, lacking discipline. We're seeing different ways to put a career together. What does it mean to have a career? Is it's a piecing together side hustles and gig work? Is it working 40 hours a week? We're seeing concerns about Gen Z's communication, their work ethic. They are a massive headache. Not that different than the cries we had about millennials when they entered the workplace. Maybe a slightly different flavor. And interestingly, for the Gen Xers on the call, I think there were quite a few based on the intro activity. Gen Xers like me, Gen Z is very similar to Gen X in terms of this interest in work-life balance. And we got a similar pushback from baby boomers about being slackers because we didn't want the same level of work week that our parents were willing to embrace and use. We wanted more balance. We were called slackers. Millennials were more willing to hustle, and Gen Z is pushing back for some really interesting reasons and saying, I don't know if that's really what makes sense for us. We are seeing, this is just some more research we're seeing, Gen Xers, we still have baby boomers in the workforce. Gen Xers are still kind of hanging right beneath the boomers, waiting for their opportunities in upper leadership. Millennials, who have been called fickle job hoppers for a long time, we're not seeing that be any different than the baby boomers during their careers. So that was much ado about nothing. And then the biggest thing that's been surfacing this week, I've gotten quite a few media calls on this, is that Gen Z size-wise may take over the baby boomer role in the workplace in terms of frequency. So baby boomers were the biggest population in the workforce till 2019. They were overtaken by millennials. And now, as soon as next year, we may see Gen Z having higher numbers than boomers. So there's an interesting dynamic happening there. All right, so let's land on this slide for just a little bit in terms of the ways in which perhaps you have all seen this surface in your workplaces. So these are kind of the top 5 conversations that I've had with my clients throughout this year around things that we might not realize have a pretty substantial generational component to them. So first and foremost, flexible work. I even got a question about this at a breakfast meeting I had this morning, is of course, no one knows what to do about return to the office. We are seeing companies on their 3rd or 4th iteration around what makes sense. We know all generations want flexibility, that we can say with certainty for different reasons. But what we're seeing surface is very interesting is, what does flexible mean for somebody who always had to go in 5 days a week? If you're used to 60-hour work weeks in the office and suddenly your employer says our new policy is everyone needs to come back 3 days a week, that seems okay, right? The contrast effect is that that's better than 5 days a week. Sign me up. If you're a Gen Z that started your job during the pandemic and you were expected to be in an office 0 days a week and had complete autonomy over your space and time, 3 days a week is a big difference. So now you commute and you have to figure out, how to do that and how that fits in with everything else you have going on in your life. So I want you to think about the generational contrast effect. If you started with 5 and were asked to go in 3, your attitude's going to be very different than if you started with 0 and were asked to go up to 3. So what does flexible mean for different generations is really, really important. Something I'm doing a study on right now, and also it's finals week at my university, and I had 2 or 3 of my students do projects on this, the changing, shifting norms around mental health conversations in the workplace. So Gen Z, bless them, has broken down a lot of prior existing stigmas around mental health, which is fantastic, and talking about mental health. What we're seeing in the workplace is that's causing a lot of complication when a Gen Z comes in and shares with perhaps a Gen X or baby boomer boss that they are having mental health challenges. Because baby boomers as a norm were told that, mental health wasn't even necessarily a real thing. Maybe best case scenario, it's something that you deal with on your own. You certainly don't talk about it in the workplace. Gen X may be the next iteration of that, where yes, mental health is very real, but I have to deal with it on my own. It's not something my company is going to talk to me about, nor am I going to bring it up. And then we have millennials a step further to maybe being more into things like self-care, but more separation between that and their workplace. And now with Gen Z, that curtain has pretty much been lifted. We're seeing a lot of Gen Zs disclose mental health diagnoses at work, as well as expect substantial mental health support as part of their workplace. So you can imagine that is creating some confusion. What are we allowed to talk about at work? And probably the most practical question is, how accommodating are we expected to be, or do we need to be? Can we expect people to still get work done if they're having mental health challenges? How valid are some of them? Are they just being used kind of as excuses? I've heard all gamuts of that. The third one, what does work ethic mean? So I probably once a week will get somebody saying to me, what are we going to do with the fact that Gen Z doesn't have a work ethic? They don't want to work 40 hours a week. They refuse to work 40 hours a week. Well, the Gentelligent question is, what does work ethic mean by generation? What is it? Work ethic doesn't have a definition. It's subjective. So if work ethic means work as much as your employer needs you to work, that's very different as a norm than I will work as hard as I need to pay for my basic needs, and then I don't want to work anymore. Or I don't think I should have to sacrifice my life and my well-being for an employer who might fire me, at the drop of a hat. So we're seeing some interesting differences, and I don't mean to keep comparing Gen Z to everyone else, but we're seeing a lot of interesting differences around what role should work have in one's life. And baby boomers, the norm was a lot. Gen X, the norm was not so much. We want to have more autonomy and work-life balance. Millennials were taught a norm that work is incredibly important and your success at work is a big deal to everyone. And now Gen Z, coming of age and working in a time when work is chaotic and was perceived as dangerous, is kind of taking a Gen X route and saying, I don't know if I'm willing to give up a big part of my life for something that, I may or may not find as important as my parents did. Now, the reality of how you're then going to support yourself is a question that we're wrestling with and that they're going to have to figure out as well. Then just kind of pushing on here, I just did an article in Fast Company that came out a couple months ago about feedback. Coming off of the last year, like year-end performance reviews, managers were giving their youngest employees a lot of, constructive feedback and criticism as part of performance reviews. And a lot of Gen Zs were leaving companies as a result of that. And so we were getting a lot of fragile snowflakes. They can't handle criticism, which is kind of the cliched version. But what was going on is this is the first time many Gen Zs had ever been given developmental feedback. We didn't raise that generation to get a lot of negative feedback. And during the pandemic, we didn't really give people feedback. And so understanding what feedback is for, the role it plays in a company, that's a changing landscape. And then just finally, a lot of conversations around transparency and generations, millennials and Gen Zs growing up at a time when information is readily available to anybody who wants it, pushing for more degrees of transparency and context and explanation in their companies that older generations didn't have at their age or their career stage. So these are just top of mind sort of conversations and topics that I've been working through. Happy to answer questions about those. It looks like we've got a lot of great conversation and questions in the chat. So I am going to just push forward with a couple tools, and then we can circle to the questions and enter into any part of conversation you guys want. I'm really excited, as Fanny said, we were very surprised that our Gentelligence article was included in the book that came out just this October as a definitive management idea. So I'm hoping this means we are turning the corner on this. You might remember, if you joined us last year, the 4 Gentelligence practices from our book. And what I've done is I've actually added a set of what I love to call power questions for each one of these. So if we go back to the idea that I'm going to hopefully help us have smarter intergenerational conversations around many things, those recent current event issues included, how do we do that? When you are working with someone older or younger and you're seeing a situation, whether it's communication or flexibility or whatever it is in a different way, how do you enter that conversation in a different way that will lead to a more constructive outcome? That is my goal. So I'm going to take us through a couple power questions for each one of these practices, and then we'll open it up with the rest of the time we have for some conversation. All right, so as a quick summary, our first practice is identifying assumptions we're making. So these are, of course, things like biases that we want to be aware of. But as you can tell from some of the examples I've given you, it's also where are we assuming that we are defining and looking at things in the same way? Flexibility, transparency, work ethic, when in fact, those assumptions are not valid. We are looking at those in very different ways for reasons that make a lot of sense if we take a generational lens to it. So here are the 2 power questions I want to give to you to put into your toolkit. So quick examples around this. So let's say you are at work and somebody makes a broad sweeping comment and they say, well, you know, we're all going to need to learn about AI, but not Ted. Ted's going to retire soon, and I'm sure he doesn't care about it. Okay, well, that's an assumption. That's a stereotype. That very professional question that works in any direction is for you to kind of stop the conversation and say, well, hey, is that necessarily true? Like Ted might find this to be really, really interesting. I've heard him talk about things like this before. Or, you know, Gen Z workers are lazy. I don't know what's going to happen with them. Is that necessarily true? Because, you know, Sarah downstairs is 23 and she's crushing it. She's amazing. So I don't know that we can necessarily conclude that about everybody in that generation. So the question on the left there is just to break up the assumptions and the bias that we have around age and generation. And then the question on the right is for conversations where we realize, because of the benefit of maybe our Gentelligence background now, that we are potentially having 2 very different conversations. So we're talking about flexibility or career development or whatever it is. Stopping that conversation and saying, before we go any further, I wonder if we're defining this in the same way. When I say development, that you know, we want to make sure you feel like this is a place that's going to develop you as a teacher, as an employee. What does development mean to you? What a great, curious question that might completely blow up, you know, what we thought we were talking about and allow us to have a deeper level of understanding. The next practice, adjusting the lens. So how do we be curious and not judgmental, to take that quote and bring it back into the conversation? When you hear someone of a different generation make a comment about work that you don't agree with, it's often because that's not our norm. We didn't learn that norm. That's not how we did it, or we do it, or we like it. And so immediately we jump to judgment. I don't do it that way, so it's wrong. I don't do it that way. You need to change. And how do we step back, break that pattern and say, oh, okay, I need to think about why they might say that. And then we can, from there, figure out what's next or what we do about the fact that we have different norms about this. Instead of jumping to what's wrong with them, they're wrong. So a couple adjust the lens questions to help you with these conversations. My favorite, can you help me understand? So if you have someone who is saying that they're going to leave your organization because they don't feel people care about them, they're not being developed, and you think, what are you talking about? We gave you a performance review. Like, I pop in and check and see how you're doing all the time. immediately we'll say, oh, Gen Z snowflake isn't being developed. Let's adjust the lens. Okay, can you help me understand why you believe that you aren't necessarily getting the development that you're hoping for? Or, you have somebody sitting at your meeting typing away on their laptop, which you're finding very distracting. Can you help me understand why the laptop's out? It can be a little thing or a big thing. And then I get the question a lot, well, do I have to just let them do it their way? What if that doesn't make sense, or it really is a problem for us and our organization and our values? And then we hop to the question on the right, which is, oh, here's my perspective. Here's why I don't think that we should have laptops out, or here's why I really think we are concerned about your development, and here's how we've been showing it. What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? Or given that we have different norms on this, what might make the most sense going forward to reach the goals that we all have? Those kinds of things. Just throwing these out as examples. All right, let's do the last two, and that should hopefully leave a good 15, 20 minutes for questions. So this next one around strengthening trust, I find really interesting, because we know the number one reason people leave their jobs is they don't feel valued. And I only feel valued if I trust and believe my organization sees me and cares about me and is okay with the fact that my concerns, my needs might show up in a way that people older and younger might not understand, or might have a different take on. So a great example, because I don't want to leave us Gen Xers out of this mix. We don't get a lot of Gen X based examples, but there was a wonderful article about a month ago that came out talking about that Gen X right now has a really interesting set of needs and concerns around benefits. So what kinds of benefits make sense for somebody who is in, the Gen X phase of a career? And how could an organization acknowledge that and tell them, we care about you here, stuck in the middle of all these other generations? And organizations are doing things like elder care benefits, helping teenagers apply for college, creating flexible work for people in that stage of life who may have very different priorities than people just starting or people closer to retirement. So that's an example of, is this a place that sees me? Do they understand the value I'm adding? And can I trust that they are going to appreciate the way I add value, but also understand that I might have different needs that need to be met? So these two questions are great ones for performance reviews or developmental conversations or stay interviews or whatever is sort of the approach in your organization, or maybe just a coffee you're having with somebody that you really value at any age or stage, and you want to make sure that they feel appreciated and cared about. I love these questions. I chose these because older people are less likely to ask for help or opportunities to learn, and younger people are less likely to take risks and contribute ideas because they don't want to be perceived as entitled. So on either end of the age spectrum or in between, questions like, what's something you'd love to learn more about, is really inviting everyone to be developed and upskilled. Do you think your talents are being well utilized here, is a great question at any age. What are these people good at? What kinds of unique expertise do they have that maybe we aren't thinking about that we could definitely use? So those are the kinds of questions I think that can really open up all kinds of potential. And then finally, expanding the pie. I had a great article sent to me from Spain where they wrote about Gentelligence, and they called this one Bake a Bigger Cake, which is way better than expand the pie. So I'm thinking of changing it, but expanding the pie. So how do we turn this into a win-win? How is the fact that I work with Gen Zs all day, every day, can that be a way that I can become better at my work, as opposed to, oh, I'm threatened by these people because they have different ideas than me? And vice versa. How can I, as a younger person, benefit from the knowledge of people older than me, instead of feeling like they're in my way or they aren't understanding how my challenges are different than their challenges? How do we step into this idea that learning across generations is going to be mutually beneficial for all of us. And we have to step away from the competition. So the last set of questions here, and then we'll open it up for your questions. My very favorite power question. So if you don't use any of them, try this one, if you would, for me, is that one there on the left. And I'm going to give you an example. So let's say you are at a meeting for your school, your organization, and your supervisor, your director says, these are our goals. These are our key, objectives for the coming year. Here's the things that we absolutely are going to be focusing on in terms of our energy. I want all hands on deck. Let's figure this out. Let's do it together. And you go back and you are meeting with your team. And let's say in this case, you are one of the older senior people on your team. Think about turning to one of the younger members in the room, younger people on your team, and saying, well, it's a really interesting meeting. We certainly have a big challenge ahead of us. I'm curious, given that conversation, how would you approach it? And that simple question is doing about 15 things. It's showing respect to a younger person on your team who might think their opinion doesn't matter yet, or they're not allowed to speak up. It's giving them permission to share a different viewpoint that definitely is going to be a new perspective. And what's going to happen, and I do this often in my work, is you're going to get some really different ideas from somebody who is substantially different age than you. And maybe as a younger person, they're going to be raw ideas, or they're going to be ideas that you immediately think, well, that's never going to work. But you as the older person are not going to shut those down. You aren't going to say, well, we tried that 3 years ago, or that would never work. You're going to listen. And then from the listening, you're going to think, well, what about that is valuable? What did we not consider? How could we benefit from that new idea? And then you're also going to use that as your opening to mentor and teach. Because what's happening that's getting in the way of expanding the pie is when older people want to share their knowledge, they feel like younger people aren't listening or paying attention, that they're putting their hands over their ears. Younger people are saying, I don't want to lecture. I respect that person. I'm sure they have things to teach me, but when they talk to me, it's like a lecture that is completely ignoring the world that I live in, or how my challenges are now a little different than theirs were at my age. But when an older person uses something like this as an opportunity to say, oh, I love that second idea. Tell me more about that. And then as they hear about it, they might think, oh, yeah, but there's some things they don't realize. You could then say, oh, that's really interesting. How do you think we would deal with the budget concern? That's a question I have. Or we'd have to get management to sign off on that. Do you think that would be difficult, right? You're suggesting, you're using your expertise and your experience to help develop their idea and help them get traction. And you're also mentoring and teaching as a result. And now we'll flip it. Okay, last example. So if I am a younger person on that team and I just sat through that meeting about our goals as an organization, and I turn to a senior person and I say, oh, that was really an interesting meeting. I'm curious how you would approach that challenge. Same thing, mutual respect, showing that you care about context and you know that person has different viewpoints and experience than you. You could ask their advice. If you were me, what would you do to help our organization get there? Or if you had an idea and you were at my stage, how would you introduce it? Asking for advice is a great way to get a partner. It's a great way to get an ally and an advocate. And again, it shows that respect that often is missing in intergenerational interactions. All right, looks like we have a ton of questions. I want to make sure I leave time for that. That's our mantra. That's what we're going to leave in the back of our heads. I'll put this one up for just a minute, and then we'll go ahead and take those questions. So if you're not on my list to send Gentelligence things to, I would love to have you on there. I've got some great new stuff I've been pushing out. So I would love to have you join me there, either via text or using that QR code. So now what I will do is I will, I don't even know where to start, Fanny. Where do we want to start here? Do we want to start with Q&A maybe? Let's see what we got in our Q&A.
You're right. There's so much.
There's so much. All right, let's go to the Q&A here. Let's see. Parenting styles. Let's see. Why do you believe more people in the workforce are experiencing anxiety or feeling overwhelmed? I think I'll start with that one, if that's okay. I'm just kind of pick and choosing. So that's a great question from Anna. So I think, Anna, it's a couple of different things. I think we are seeing a workforce post-COVID where people feel slightly more permission to speak up about anxiety and being overwhelmed. I think during COVID, we had to care about our people's well-being and their life outside of work. And I feel like that really gave people permission who maybe were feeling anxious and overwhelmed before, but didn't think that it was acceptable to bring it up. A little bit more ability to do that. They felt like their organization was willing to care more about them as a person. I think that's one piece of it. I also think social media has created a support system there's lots of negative things about social media and mental health as well. But I think particularly people are realizing they're not alone, and they're realizing that, these are valid concerns that they are allowed to talk about. And they're bringing that into the workplace. And the third thing we're seeing is we are seeing that younger generations are more aware of mental health language. And there's a bit of a concern that sometimes people who don't have clinical mental health challenges, so not diagnosable mental health challenges, are saying things like, I have horrible anxiety, when in fact they're tired and, they've just been working too much. There's a little bit of a concern that it's becoming sort of an excuse for some people. Whereas many people have very valid mental health challenges. There's a concern about, when everybody knows what this is, what is really something that needs to have, for example, reasonable accommodations in the workplace versus what is just learning how to manage, life and work. So that's particularly in education, we see that first, right? So that's, I think, some things that are contributing to that. Let's see. Fanny, are there any of these questions you want me to make sure I answer?
Yes, I do. There's one here, and I've had this question asked before, and it was about how the different generations came up with their labels, how they were identified. That was a question, but I read it someplace in here.
Yeah, so it depends largely on the generation we're talking about. Baby boomers were a generation that were recognized by the U.S. Census because that was defined primarily through population growth. So when population went up after World War II, we started the baby boomers, and when it went down, we ended the baby boomers. So that's about the most precise generation. Most of them, honestly, are named by media. So it's a pop culture phenomenon. There's a name that gets suggested, and then whether or not it sticks depends on whether or not we like it. So Gen X was called, several different things, but X stuck. The millennials were called Gen Y. Nobody liked that. Millennials stuck. Z, I've started calling them the Zoomers. We sometimes hear that. Again, it's often as a product of the media. And where the media specifically comes up with the name that people gravitate towards. I'm seeing Ken put a question in the Q&A and in the chat that I want to answer about accountability and standards. And I think this is
going to be my next question.
Yeah, I think that one's really important. So let's first of all remember accountability and standards. There's probably some generational norms around that, and also some objective definitions of accountability and standards. So I get the question a lot, okay, so I have young people coming in and telling me that they're burned out or they have anxiety or mental health challenges. How accommodating am I supposed to be? And can I still tell them they need to do their job? I think that is absolutely a valid question. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to bring into this conversation is our younger generations have not seen very many models of workplaces where doing your job well and having a sort of stable and reliable place to work can actually help support your mental health. So I think part of what's going on, Ken, is that our younger generations have been sort of socialized to believe you can either take care of yourself and your mental health, or you can work. And that should be a somewhat false dichotomy. So the World Health Organization defines good work as a place where I love my colleagues, I'm doing work that matters, I'm appreciated and cared about as a person, someone's expecting me to show up and do certain things, so I feel like I have accountability, I have responsibility that I can handle. There's a very strong relationship between job satisfaction and life satisfaction. So the right work should actually improve your mental health, not destroy your mental health. And I think one of the things we haven't been talking about for our youngest generation is you don't have to choose between taking care of yourself and working. You need to find a place to work where that helps you take care of yourself. And I also think on the accountability question that it is not necessary, unless we're talking about an acute mental health crisis. I want to be careful that I'm not downplaying that. But for the maybe more normal kinds of stress and anxiety, we are not finding that letting people shirk responsibility and accountability improves their stress level. So just in my world, if I say to a student, oh, you don't have to take your final exam, you've been through a lot, that actually is not good for them long-term, because they're going to end up not finishing the class or not graduating or feeling more underwater. Instead, the conversation has to sort of be, I want to make sure that you're doing all right, but part of you doing all right is you keeping up with your work and making sure that you feel like, you can be successful here. And so I want to help you try to balance both of those things. It looks like, okay, so you said, how do you approach differences in how seriously people take their work? I think that is going back to work ethic. So I think part of it is we have generational norms on how seriously should you take work. So you have everything from a baby boomer generation that we're told, like, life is work. Work is life. This is what it's all about. Your identity is so much a part of your career. That was a norm. To other generations who say, not for me. I want to work enough to pay my bills and put food on my table, but then I don't want it to be everything. I don't want to have my life be consumed by my job. Those aren't right or wrong. They're just different. And so the problem we're having is when we say, no, you have to prioritize work the way I do. Otherwise, you can't work here, or you are wrong, or you have no work ethic. Everyone has a work ethic. It's just a question of what it is and whether that aligns with your organization's recipe for success. So I would say, Ken, my best advice on this is to clearly define, what does it take to be successful here, and what does success mean here? And if somebody says, oh, well, I understand I'd have to work 50 hours a week to get promoted to partner, I actually am not interested in being a partner. I'm interested in, doing some great work, learning a lot, contributing. And I understand if I only want to work 40 hours a week or 35 hours a week, that there's a trade-off to that. So I think it's about setting clear expectations, and it's about saying, well, here's sort of the maybe flexibility we can have and can't have on what we expect from people at work. And just making sure people make those choices in a way that's very conscious and aware that if they don't want to prioritize work the way other people have, that's fine. But here's what the consequences and results might be, and then allowing them to make those decisions about whether that's a place that's going to be a good fit for them. All right, I see Fanny's face, which means that I am going to wrap up. I know we could talk for hours and hours. I hope you'll have me back again, but I'm going to turn it over to Fanny. Please do join my mailing list or reach out if you have more questions.
Thank you so much. And please, everybody, don't leave just yet. I have an announcement to make, but I want to say thank you so very much, Dr. Gerhardt. That was phenomenal, as always. And I took so many notes, as I'm sure others did as well. Please remember to get her book. Check in, subscribe to her site.